Holy Motors is a landmark film in my life. I only saw it recently, but it changed some things up here and shook me in a way that a movie hasn't for a long time. This might seem really strange because to a lot of people, Holy Motors is just a weird, surreal movie. Some people would use this as the description of why it's so bad. It's just art for art's sake. It's all style, no substance. There's nothing to it. It's just weirdness. Some people will talk about that as the reason why the film is so good. People will write positive reviews gushing about how it's an experience, how it's something you just got to see. There's nothing else like it. I think both of these parties are missing out, are doing themselves a huge disservice by not trying to dig in to the intellectual things, the intellectual aspects of the movie, by almost assuming there are none, by just taking it as weirdness for the sake of weirdness. I think you miss so much on what is a phenomenally sophisticated movie that has a lot to say about our lives, a breathtaking film. Like I said, best movie I've seen in a long, long time. And I want to go through some of the reasons why it was so meaningful for me, why it touched me so deeply. I want to go through my thought process as I was watching the movie, not to solve anything definitively, but to give you some ideas about ways to think about this movie, ways to see some of the different elements of it, some of the themes that could elevate it from being much more than just weirdness for the sake of weirdness. So often when you are watching abstract films that are somewhat hard to make sense of, something you can do is think about, you can use this framework. Think about the movie as either being autobiographical or universal. This is often a good way in. Autobiographical, well, not telling the literal story of the director or the writer or somebody, but giving us sort of a metaphorical look at the sort of things that the director has done or has felt, right? Taking battles under the skin and making them concrete, giving us a way to understand certain struggles from their life. Universal, kind of the same thing, right? Not telling a literal story about things that have happened to all of us, but giving some sort of vignettes of emotional things that have happened to us. I think this is a very profitable way to look at this movie. Some people will think about Holy Motors as being just a movie about acting, right? They might say, well, as an actor, you play a lot of roles, and then there's some sort of disassociation that happens when playing all these roles. And there's something to that, but I think that's a pretty surface level reading, and there's a lot more we can get out of this movie. Now, it is true that Oscar, the main character in this film, is talked about a couple times as an actor. I'm approaching this more as being a story about Leos Carax, a director, Oscar being an analog for him rather than for an actor. But in some ways, we're really just talking about a creative person. And Leos Carax and Denis Lavant, the actor who plays Oscar, have a long, long storied connection. Leos Carax's name, actually, it's not his real name. His real name is Alex, his first name. And Leos Carax is an anagram of Alex and Oscar. This is the third Leos Carax film I've seen, and one that gives me real faith in him, one that suggests very strongly that the man's a genius. What can I say? The first film I watched was Lovers on the Bridge. The second was Bad Blood. And the third, Holy Motors. This is actually a very good order to watch the movies in, and if you haven't seen any of them, I would suggest watching Lovers on the Bridge first. It is by far the most accessible, and it's a great movie. Bad Blood, similarly. Both of these movies are about tormented love, essentially. They're edgy films. They've got interesting style all over the place in some ways, chaotic in some ways. When I watch those, I like these movies a lot. But at the back of my mind, I wondered, to what extent are they just sort of edginess? Are they just sort of chaos for the sake of it? This movie, Holy Motors, if it speaks to you, I think will reassure you that Leos Carax is about much more than just style. So the last thing to mention before we jump into actually talking about the movie is that I'm going to talk first about the substance of the different sections and then about the mechanism that joins the sections together, which is also how the movie is kind of structured. For the first half of the movie, you basically have to accept that you're going to be watching different vignettes and we're going to be transitioning from one to another somehow. And then in the second half of the movie, we start having more focus and time put towards what the mechanism is, who actually is Oscar, what does he do, why is he doing these things. So we'll talk about those sort of in that order. We start in a theater. The audience is sleeping, but there are lions roaming amongst them. This could be a provoking film experience. I mean, you go to a movie and there are lions roaming the theater. Wow. A movie that could change your life. But it isn't, because you're sleeping through it, right? I think we have some early evidence for why it makes sense to think of this as an autobiographical film to some degree. Surely Leos Carax has some, feels this way to some extent when he puts out some movie that is extreme, that has the potential to rip your head off, but the audience in some ways sleeps through it. Leos Carax is actually in the beginning of the film. So there's a man in the hotel room sleeping who wakes up, and he walks over to the wallpaper of the hotel room, which is a forest. And for some reason, his hand has a key in it somewhere. And that key slots into a little lock on the wall. He turns it, and the wall opens up, and he goes into the theater to watch them. This might seem bizarre, but I think it's actually a relatively approachable metaphor. Leos Carax is, in some ways, ingrained, contextualized in a rather bland mainstream economic thing, the hotel room, right? A hotel is just about the most, sort of mainstream bland place you could be staying. It's interesting that this mainstream infrastructure on the walls of the hotel, are wood. So there's some sort of artificial, natural connection here. Leos Carax, for some reason, he has a key on his hand, right? So he personally has some ability, something a little bit different he possesses, but it's a little bit bizarre what it is, right? This key in the hand, that's kind of strange, but for one reason or another, he has this, and it is just as absurd. I mean, it's not a coincidence that this is an absurd talent, right? His eye as a director, whatever, it's an absurd talent. Not in the sense that like, oh, he's a genius, although he is, but just in that he does feel, I guess, to some extent, like a weirdo for having this key on his hand that allows him to escape from the hotel room and into the theater. And there he looks down, watches the film, and the audience sleeping through it. Interesting. So, like I said, I think the first part, and actually the first part of each half, are some of the easiest pieces of the film to wrap your head around by far, and they fit very nicely into this autobiographical lens to some extent. But there's also a universal way to look at this as well. There are definitely things from time to time that you're interested in that are hugely compelling and moving for you. The lions for you, the things that are fierce and such, either the things that scare you, the things that inspire you, the things that transform you and such, the things that drive you. And other people just don't see it the same way, right? They sleep through the movie and they never see those things. Very common to experience something like that for everybody. So the first little vignette that we get to is the beggar, right? Oscar dresses up as a beggar and walks through the streets. Now, who hasn't cast themselves as a beggar from time to time, either from self-pity or from genuine dishevelment, right? Inevitable. There is a universal beggar in all of us from time to time. But for Leos Carax in particular, he surely has spent plenty of time trying to get his films financed, and almost certainly he's had this feeling of begging on the street to some extent, either self-pity or genuine dishevelment in an attempt to get the movies made. The next little piece we get to is the motion capture section, right? Here, being a filmmaker seems to be a little bit like being a secret agent. It's kind of cool. He goes to this undercover location, playing with the newest toys. It's interesting, by the way, the buildings that he's in, they remind me a little bit of like the Pompidou Center or something, which is an often discussed in some of the literature on postmodernism. The Pompidou Center comes up as a new way to connect humans to buildings and such. And this section seems to be leaning very heavily on the postmodern thing a little bit. What are these new toys for? What is this new technology for? Well, it's extracting pure sex and violence scientifically, right? Motion capture. Interesting. Of course, we also see throughout this film a couple snippets of early cinema. And motion capture, in some ways, is a bold new technology, but in some ways, it's also just the essence of film. Surely all film is motion capture in a way, but with motion capture, we have something where we are able to extract out not an entire scene, but just the image, just the symbolic act of, in this case, sex and violence, right? So those things are tied up in each other, bound up in each other, and bound up in technology. he is a cool purveyor of these. And this, this is one that might seem a little bit more like, sure, I understand how a filmmaker, it's interesting, it's like, you can sense a little bit of ambivalence here to some extent. Oscar's approach to this is workmanlike, and it's kind of interesting because you can imagine being a filmmaker, perhaps, with artistic goals and dreams, and finding yourself instead being one who extracts the pure images of sex and violence, right? You set out to be a filmmaker and you end up making car commercials or something like that, where you have to be as alluring as possible and such. And so you have a real ambivalence to this method of filmmaking, even as it's kind of cool, right? Even as you get to seem a little bit like a secret agent and play with new toys, the thing that you're doing is not exactly the dream of creative cinema in some ways. Interesting. Now, how the heck does this have some universality to it? Well, to some extent, I think that when we ourselves partake in new technological worlds, we are doing some of these things. You look at something like some new social media and such. TikTok, for instance. Perhaps there we have something going on of the extraction of the pure images, not so much violence, but definitely not graphic sex, but sex appeal to some extent. These things are extracted out, and we partake in these through some sort of technological infrastructure and network. We play with the newest toys, and the newest things of modernity are linked up, tied up in the same ideas. So you are a producer as a filmmaker of these images, but you're also you're a consumer of them as well in your daily life. All of us are now. And, with social media, with democratized media, you may also be an amateur producer as well. Okay. So that's this whole motion capture piece of it. Like I said, this is a little bit leaning into the postmodernism, a little bit harvesting the pure images and such, which is maybe not what you would expect to do or what you would want to be doing as a filmmaker, but it is kind of cool in some ways. You lean into it. Okay. Now, next we have Monsieur Merde is the next section, which is the leprechaun or the troll, a rabble rouser. This is perhaps how Carax feels, or how he is perceived, or how he thinks he's perceived when he steps into elitist circles that his films inevitably circulate in or are connected with. No manners, speaks in tongues, goes against all the conventions, not polite, doesn't know which fork to use first, and such. And this is, again, something that I think is probably in some ways somewhat relatable, going into an elitist circle or something like that, feeling out of place, and rather than cowering or being embarrassed, doubling down on being out of place, right? The leprechaun does not think, oh, darn, I shouldn't be here, and then hobble off into the background. It says, let me make myself as big as possible. Let me make as big impact as I can. There's a rebellious streak to it. And I think that is deeply relatable in some way. For Carax, coming from sort of this underground cinema, but interacting with the very wealthy circles who partake in art film or whatever, almost certainly he feels some friction here. And maybe this section is exposing that to some extent. He heists a model, right? This is Eva Mendes, I think. He heists a model, but only to lead her back into the underground, to the underworld, and give her very strange directions, right? To rework her femininity and such. Don't wear a dress, wear some sort of burqa thing, something like that, to rework her instructions and her world in his strange underground thing. This seems like a very clear parallel to Carax working with more famous actresses and such, and plucking them from some sort of mainstream. And in fact, he probably does this with Eva Mendes in this very film, right? Maybe this is describing the act of working with her and with Kylie Minogue as well, taking these well-known mainstream actresses, bringing them into a strange underworld and reworking the instructions and such. There's also, again, we have the tension between his underground stylings and the more elitist world or whatever, the more mainstream world, or the consumers of art film or whatever. That tension there could perhaps extend to actors and directors, or to to Leos Carax and Eva Mendes herself or Kylie Minogue. In fact, I watched an interview with Leos Carax and Kylie Minogue briefly, where the interviewer, they seem like just from separate universes completely. I mean, nothing against Kylie Minogue exactly, but she spends her time talking about her hairdresser and how her hairdresser allowed her to like connect to Leos Carax, and that's how they got to know each other or something. And Leos Carax seems extremely shy throughout the entire interview, hesitant and not interested in the hairdresser or whatever, some sort of friction. Finally, having satisfied himself, Monsieur Merde lies beside her, drapes himself over her, naked. This is his creation. There's a moment of pride, like, here, take the picture. This is it. This is my creation. Pride, but also foolish vulnerability, right? Not to mention that the model here has a certain docile requirements, right? Just sort of blindly follows the instructions. Perhaps another comment on how we go about making these films. Anyway, Monsieur Merde lays himself out, is completely vulnerable, completely revealed at the end of this. And perhaps this is a lot like what it means to make a movie, to pluck something from the elite, take it, do weird things with it, and then reveal yourself alongside your strange manipulation of these things. Okay. Next, we have the daughter. The scene with the daughter. So this is where Oscar is the dad, and he goes to pick his daughter up from a party, and it turns out that the daughter was just it was a wallflower, was hiding in the bathroom or something like that. And here again, we seem to have a somewhat similar theme of unpopularity. Leos Carax perhaps having to grapple with that. A very simple reading would be like, he makes a movie and it's not popular. How do you handle that? And such. But there's a more general idea of separation of yourself from your work, putting something out into the world and how it reflects on you. The father is hurt by the daughter's shyness. It's interesting because he in some ways fails to empathize, right, with his daughter. Well, I mean, he, not in some ways, he fails to empathize with his daughter. And this seems in some ways like a character flaw. But on the other hand, he's hurt by an attack on him. The daughter sort of offhandedly says, well, it's because I'm just like you, or that I'm so shy, or something along those lines, right? And so for both of them, this is an intimate experience. And yes, there's some disconnect. There's some empathetic disconnect. But does it go one way, or could it possibly go both ways? And here maybe we have a story. In some ways, it's maybe a continuation of the very last thing. Carax trying to understand the relationship between him and his work, or between him and some of the people he works with. After this scene, Michel Piccoli is in the limousine, and he asks Oscar, "Are you still enjoying it?" And this seems like a really weird question at this point. Enjoying it. This thing Oscar's doing, it doesn't seem particularly enjoyable, getting all these bizarre assignments from other places. Was this supposed to be fun? It reminds me almost of going to a Thanksgiving dinner and having your grandfather ask you, "So, are you having fun in life?" And you think, "Ooh, am I having fun?" You enter at whatever season of your life you're in. A lot of things feel like they're out of your control. There's so many different things that you're focusing on, so many different things that you're doing, so many different arenas that you're living your life inside of, and your grandpa asks you if you're having fun. And it, like I said, it comes out of left field. Well, Michel Piccoli, it's a very similar kind of situation. We get to the intermission here, and after the intermission, we get another one of a scene that in some ways pairs up with the beginning of the movie. Here, this is the accordion, the group of accordion players playing a song together. This is kind of the opposite of the beginning. Here, the audience is not sleeping through the film that Carax has made, but instead Carax is triumphant. He's the leader of the pack, the leader of a group of oddballs all locked in sync together with music and such. What a beautiful thing. Surely this is trying to point to what it occasionally feels like to be the leader of a movement or something like that, to have your work actually ring true for many people, inspire many people, and bring people together, creating music together and such. And again, this is something that Carax might feel from time to time, but hopefully this is also something that normal people would feel from time to time. After this, we get one of the more a scene a vignette that might be one of the more confusing ones for some people, I think. This is the Gangster. And you can think about this maybe in terms of confronting an influence. Killing something that your identity is wrapped up in. I don't want to step through the whole scene exactly, but you can think about, first encountering this influential figure, disguising yourself as this figure is maybe one thing you might do at some point, but then finding that you need to kill off the figure for your own well-being or something like that. But of course, when you go to do that, you accidentally wing yourself to some extent because you and the inspiration are, to some degrees, one and the same. Killing something that your identity is wrapped up in. For a creative person like a director, this could be trying to handle another cinematic influence. Do you make movies that are very similar or very different? How do you do this? There's a more universal reading of this. Killing something that your identity is wrapped up in. You could talk about that as being something as simple as an X or something like that. These are some of the this is basically the first half plus a little bit more of the substance. And you can see, I think that it's, quite profitable to think about this as autobiographical or universal. You can get a lot of mileage out of that for a lot of movies. And in this one, it lines up a lot of the little pieces that might seem really surreal. It makes them all fit together kind of nicely. But what of the actual mechanic that draws these scenes together? Before we get to that, I want to mention the word aleatory. What does that mean? Well, aleatory comes from the Latin alea, meaning dice, I think. And in some ways, it just means random. But there's a little bit more connotation to this. I think one of the first uses of it was in making aleatory music, which is music that is in some ways random. And of course, a lot of music is in some ways random, but this would be, to some degree, there's some sort of formula here, where there's sort of a very clearly controlled randomness, pieces that can swap around and such. I think there was a movie, I can't remember where I read about this, but I think there was a movie, for instance, where it was designed for the reels to be shuffled prior to showing it. So you would show up to the theater and the projectionist would shuffle around the reels and then show you the movie in a random order, aleatory. Aleatory music, how close is our life to aleatory music, to the reels in the random order? Some sort of story overall, an arc overall, but also profoundly random, scrambled up, moved into different places. This also might echo our environment to some extent, right? You live in a city, you've seen things change, you've seen things move around, you've seen the gas station go from here to there and such, you've seen things shuffle. Actually, gas stations don't move that much because they got the stuff underground or whatever. But to what extent do we have an aleatory environment? And as our environment transcends the terrestrial, with more and more time being spent in the virtual worlds of social media and such, the aleatory aspects are perhaps redoubled and such. In life, there are so many different possibilities, so many different things you might become. You might think about being fantasies and regret. Fantasy and regret, those things are very similar. Regret in some ways is a fantasy in the past tense, something that could have been, something supplied by the imagination. One of the next story we get to is about the banker, the execution of the banker. And we see the banker recur a number of times in the film, actually. Oscar's character seems sort of bound up in this sort of alternate world of being a banker. The banker and the creative are a particularly interesting parallel, and I don't think it's any coincidence that this recurs in the movie a number of times. The idea of doing something like playing it safe, being a banker, putting your faith in the mainstream economy, giving yourself over to it, and the opposite, being a creative person, spurning those structures, trying to undermine them. Those two things are profoundly different, and many people are lost in contemplation between the two of them, whether to take a risk and do something creative or not. Very, very common thing to think about in life, and that's echoed in this movie. This is perhaps just one of the many different fragmented possibilities of our lives, or maybe it's two broad categories of many different possibilities in our lives, or maybe there's some spectrum between banker and actor, right? Where one of those things is the most locked down and one of them is the most free. But either way, so many different ways to live your life. and such. How do we think about all the things that we could have possibly become? Interesting. There's some big twists in this movie that really start to reveal what's going on here. The first one, I think, is in the deathbed vignette when Oscar's playing some elderly man. I think his niece comes to visit him. They act out the scene, and then afterwards, Oscar wakes back up, and he talks to the other person a little bit, and you realize that this other person is also an actor. So it is not just Oscar, but it's everybody in this world who is participating on this. It's not just a statement about the individual. It's not just a statement about an actor, but it's everybody who has these constellations of possibilities, all these different things that they're bouncing between aleatory lives, not ruled entirely by themselves, but which are selected for them to some degree by some infrastructural force, a limousine carrying us from place to place. The next big twist is when he gets a sincere glance. This is Kylie Minogue's character, right? Oscar is going from place to place, and he sees another limousine. He sees another actor. And in a moment, they both roll their windows down, and they see each other, and they realize that they know each other. Something transcends the aleatory nature, right? Something transcends all the chaos, all the different possibilities, all the different chapters in our lives, all the different things that we do or that we could have done. There's something that transcends all of that, but it ends up being a bit impossible. And in this storyline, in this vignette, we return to some of the themes in other Leos Carax's films. Like I mentioned, some of his other work is really more along the lines of a tormented love story. And that's what this vignette is to some extent, between Jean and Oscar, both caught with certain aspects of their identities mixed up, both looking different, almost not recognizing themselves at first. Kylie Minogue sings a song in this section. The lyrics include, "Who would we have become if we'd done differently back then?" This is, I think, directly hinting at what is, in some ways, the number one theme of this movie, and which I've been trying to lead us to a little bit over the last few minutes. It's this aleatory life, all the different possibilities. How the heck do you think about all the different possibilities of your life, all the fantasies, all the regrets, all the paths taken and not taken? How the heck do you think about that, especially in contrasted with our finite time on the earth, that you have to pick a side? And this is where the movie started ringing pretty true. For me, in my life, I have long been plagued by an inability to pick a path, to make a choice. This is very common, right? It would seem that there are some people in the world who know from very early on that they want to be a doctor, that they want to do something. And maybe they're kidding themselves. Maybe they don't know. Maybe it's naive. But a lot of people, I think, maybe myself included, are jealous of these people who have a path, who know what they want to become. But I was never in that category. I always struggled to commit to things, to commit to one thing, to go all in on one thing, because it seemed like I would have to give up something else, right? This idea of not wanting to give something up, that's paralysis in the face of the possibilities of life. And ideally, you can get over it. There's a lot of movies about this, right? There's the film Mr. Nobody, for instance, in which a baby, not a baby, but a young child basically imagines all the different possibilities of his life. Very similar movie in some ways, not as good, but similar ideas to some extent. There's another movie, Blind Chance, the Kieslowski film, where you sort of see the different things happening. These kind of quantum movies in some ways where you get to see many of the different possibilities together. Now here we have a slightly different mechanism, but surely the different possibilities of your life is one of the central ideas of this film, and the way you're carried between them, not in control. And occasionally something transcends that. Occasionally you meet somebody, right? Jean and Oscar seem to have a connection that's bigger than these infrastructural coercions of life, right? But it isn't to be. Jean has a new assignment. Jean has a new boyfriend. Jean throws herself off a building, right? This section also, the fact that Jean dies, not just as an act, but that seemingly she really dies. By the way, when the new boyfriend is running up the stairs, so Jean is apparently, she says she's playing a flight attendant, Eva Grace, in the last night of her life. Oscar heads down the stairs. A boyfriend runs up the stairs and calls out to Jean, not as Eva Grace, not as the character, but to Jean. Interesting. They jump off the building together, and when Oscar gets to the street below, they're lying there together. And we've made another little move here. Hold on a minute. This wasn't a scene, right? In a previous scene, Oscar dies, his character dies, but right after it, he gets back up and he talks to the other person. Doesn't seem like the same thing happens here. Seems like Jean is really gone. And we are attacking sort of a disassociation between our actions and our personalities, between our actions and our identities. I think maybe people try to build up a disassociation between their identities and their actions to preserve not becoming, to keep more things available, to keep more things on the table, right? To preserve not becoming. You know, I think of myself sometimes, you know, I've been working as a software engineer for a couple of years now. Do I think of myself as a software engineer? I don't. For some reason, I think of myself as still having so many different possibilities, so many different things I could do with my life. And the idea of doing that one thing for my entire career is extremely frightening. And yet, most likely, that is what I will do. I try to maintain some disassociation between that action and my identity, because the moment that I don't have that disassociation, my life has collapsed from a constellation of possibilities into just one path, the path that I actually took. And that is called getting older, aging, right? Your life going from many different possibilities to simply being the things that you did. And so this scene where no longer is Jean playing a character to some extent, but she's herself. She's not playing with house money, you know, she's playing for keeps. This is the real thing. Jumps off the building and she is actually dead. The disassociation between your action and your identity is gone, right? And that's something that's a spectrum that we go throughout for the entire movie. In the beginning, it almost seems playful, the way that Alex goes between these different things. He dips his toe in the water of different things. He tries out different things. The stakes don't seem very high. He's going to lead so many different lives, but perhaps as things go on, or as you get a bit older, the stakes do increase, and there's much less of a buffer. There's much less of a chance to go and try something else, to be something different and such. Interesting. Again, the lyrics, who would we have become if we'd done differently back then, seem to be very clearly hinting at some of the ideas of the movie. The final twist is the final appointment. Right, so Oscar starts out the movie at a house, right? He starts out waking up somewhere else. He has a family he says goodbye to or whatever. He says, I'll see you this evening and such. And you don't know until the final appointment if he's going to have a final appointment and then he's going to go back to that place because that's his family. If there's some grounding, if there's some truth, if there's some ground truth, right? If there's some real life that he leads, or if this is all there is, right? If this is life, just being moved from chapter to chapter in a way that you're not entirely in control, in a way where you are always, to some extent, acting out. And it turns out he never does go back home. His final appointment is to go to a different house, right? And this is seen, at first it seems like there isn't anything too extreme about this, right? It's just a house in the suburbs. Oscar gets out of the car and he hesitates for a long time before going in. Why does he hesitate? Well, again, because of how permanent it is, the fear of permanence, things collapsing, all the different possibilities of your life collapsing into one. You know, it's hard to imagine. I struggle to imagine myself as a, 45-year-old or whatever, coming home to a family. And I think for a lot of people that's true. And for a lot of people who are 45-year-olds coming home to a family, maybe there is a similar moment of hesitation, a question of how the heck did I get here? How did I become this? And to some extent, a sorrow that they will never be anything else, right? Regret. That there were all these other things, all these other possibilities in life at one point that have been chopped off, orphaned, cut off, and are gone. Oscar hesitates on the threshold for a long time. It's bizarre, this kind of life. How strange it is to be anything at all, as they say. And eventually when he goes in, we get an underscore of just how bizarre this whole thing is, because it turns out his family are a bunch of gorillas. For some people who, I guess, don't have the thread of the movie to some extent, this might seem like just like another incredibly left field moment. Like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Now it's gorillas. Are you just having a laugh? Like, what the heck is this ending? But the way that I've walked through it, it feels like the most natural thing possible, because it is so bizarre to lead that kind of life, to lead, in some ways, a normal life. It's so alienating to be one thing, right? To be stuck. So alienating. It's interesting. And that's most of the movie. I mean, there's a couple other things. So we see Celine take the car to the central location, Holy Motors. I'll tell you about the title in a second. Celine goes and leaves. She puts on a mask to leave. This is a slightly odd moment, but again, there seems to be something absurd. Not even Celine has a normal life to go back to. This whole thing is kind of absurd. Not even she has a face. She calls somebody, says she's going to be home. And again, it seems like she's returning to some neutral grounding point. Seems like she's going to her own suburb to lead some sort of normal, non-absurd, neutral life. But alas, there is no such thing. And she confirms it by placing on this mask before leaving. And then we get a very sort of Tati-esque ending with the cars talking to each other, which is a great sort of bit of playfulness in some extent. Final thing is, why is this movie called Holy Motors? And hopefully, given the story I've just told, it's actually somewhat straightforward. Understanding the title. Holy Motors is a collision of the infrastructural and the spiritual, right? So I've talked a lot about sort of these infrastructural forces that seem to be carrying you around, right? The limousine, the little bubble that you're carried around in your life, your own little portable meaning and such, from which demands are issued that you enter into these different chapters, carry out these different things, right? How that is something that Kairos does as a filmmaker, but also that we do as individuals. The infrastructure and the spiritual collide. In the past, maybe a long time ago, you'd pray for rain because you were a farmer, and the rain would control your life, right? Would control your fortunes, determine if you could eat and such, if your crops would grow or not. Spiritual. That is a spiritual infrastructure, essentially, of the crops, the farm, and the good Lord above blessing you with rain or not, right? Not to say that this is actually how it works, but this is how people conceive of it and such. Spirituality comes from this. Well, fast forward a few years, and we aren't farmers. Instead, we're riding around in our little built environments, in our little infrastructure, and there's still a spiritual element to it, right? Reckoning with the possibilities of your life is a profoundly spiritual thing, being carried between the different possibilities of your life, just like a farmer who must survive a drought or has a bountiful harvest and such. We reckon with the infrastructure and how it determines the many different possibilities of our lives, how it arbitrates what we become, and how we can move between different chapters and things. And so Holy Motors seems to be a perfectly apt title, perhaps slightly in jest. How is it that we've reached this place where the car and the infrastructure is holy, but perhaps also an entirely sincere title, pointing out exactly how things are? So like I said, a landmark movie for me. I mean, I touched a little bit on how some of these themes have been a big piece of my life for a long time. These ideas of all the different possibilities, trying to keep your options open. Very simple term, right? Some people will say that casually at times. Oh, I'm applying to different jobs or something, and right now I'm just trying to keep my options open, they'll say casually. But on the other hand, keeping your options open is a profound idea, inherently connected to youth, essentially. And the song at the end of the movie really seems to hammer this home. It's also interesting that Alex sort of becomes progressively sicker throughout the movie and such, decaying in some way, aging in some way, having some of these things lopped off. I can understand that this movie can seem a little bit strange at times, but like I said, for me, very moving film that offered probably the most compelling way I've seen to think about the different possibilities of your life out of anything. Like I said, there are other movies, Blind Chance, Mr. Nobody, other things that focus on sort of the different way things could go. But this one is, for me, far and away the best. And the final thing to say is just, watching this movie, it makes me in awe of how somebody makes a movie like this, all these different ideas, all these different elements. This is just one reading, but all these different things to it. How do you set aside? How do you come up with this? All the different creative elements, all the different unexpected things, but also all the different ideas, the profoundly important ideas in this movie, the things that it says about life that you can barely express with words, as I've perhaps gotten across. How the heck do you make a movie like this? And the answer is by being an artist, and a genius one at that. And so I'd just like to end with a thank you to Leos Carax for putting this movie into the world and for fighting against all odds. I'm sure it wasn't easy to make something so incredible. So that's the highest praise I can give a movie, essentially, is thank you. And that's what Holy Motors gets from me. A phenomenal, phenomenal movie that, like I said, I think it's far more than just a bizarre, surreal experience.